Hello and welcome to the Car Care Auto Reviews channel, and welcome to the first Genesis review on the channel. This is the Genesis G80, not the normal one, the electrified one. In this video, we're going to do a proper technical review of the Genesis G80 Electrified. We're going to take a look at how Genesis is doing their electric cars. We're going to take a look at the outside, the inside, some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. But before we start that, this does not have a frunk. This is basically all hood stuff, normal stuff where your engine normally would be. Before we get into it, before we talk about the system highlights and then the components, I want to say one thing. In observing, analyzing, and learning about electric cars in preparation for the future, I have come to a conclusion that is electric cars and how well they are gauged by two things. The first one is how well is the battery management. Basically, that's going to affect your range and the overall feel of the car, how fast it is, how things are. But more importantly, how well is a thermal management system? In English, how well does this system can cool the battery and the cabin? And more importantly, how well can it warm up the battery and warm up the cabin? That last part is a lot harder in electric cars than in gasoline cars, because in gasoline cars you have a gasoline engine. Here we don't have a heat generator, and that's the problem. So let's start with the cooling system, which this car has two of them. Let's talk about the first one. The first one uses regular coolant, which is pink in color. Conductive coolant, nothing really special about it, just standard Hyundai coolant. This first cooling system cools the electric motors that drive the wheels, which in this car there's two. There's one for the front, one for the rear, because it is all-wheel drive. And then because we have electric motors, we have something called the inverter, which basically does all the magic. It drives the motors, supplies power to them. When they're in regenerative mode, it takes that power and sends it to the battery. For that matter, we have two of those, one for the front, one for the rear, and they both have tremendous amounts of heat that gets generated because of the high voltage. So we have coolant going to them to cool them or take heat from them. Keep that mental note, because that's actually very important in the thermal management system. So this first system can do multiple things. The first thing is, if the motors or inverter is too hot, it's going to cool it. Very simple. Heat exchange. This does have an electric water pump that circulates the coolant. Radiator in the front, single fan. Very simple for the cooling aspect. But for the heat, this is where we start. So this system has a three-way valve, so it can change the direction of coolant according to what we need to do here. If we need heat, and this is really the biggest thing, when we need heat, it's very cold, we need to warm up the battery, we need to warm up the cabin, it's going to actually start taking heat from the motors. Motors are driving, they have oil in them. Friction causes heat, so the coolant starts extracting heat from the electric motors. And the same thing with the inverters. Inverters, as they work, high voltage creates heat. That's just how this works. So we're going to take some of that heat and preserve it for the rainy days or the cold ones. This cooling circuit also goes to one more component, the onboard charger. That actually does generate very little heat, and this is actually a good idea because you want to get any source of heat in cold climate to heat up the battery and heat up the coolant, which then can do things and heat things as needed. So basically, in simple operation, when the system is operating, it's going to detect, do we need to heat or cool? Three-way valve can redirect the coolant where it needs to go. Do we need to cool the motors? We're just going to send cold coolant to the motors to take their heat away so they cool down. Or do we need to heat things up? We're going to direct hotter coolant to get a little bit more heat. Or we need to heat things up. It's going to change the circuit where we isolate the radiator, because the last thing we want here is to lose more heat. Isolate the radiator and make it an internal loop so we can warm up the coolant. Then the battery cooling circuit. It is pretty interesting that they actually use non-conductive coolant here. It does make sense. We're having a lot of coolant inside the battery should there be a leak. But I don't know why we have two different types of coolant, because they have the pink for the motor circuit and then blue non-conductive coolant for the battery. I wish everything was non-conductive so it makes service simpler, but that's what they did here. Something else they did is they put it both in the same container. Not exactly this, it's just one big unit that has two separate containers. I don't know why they do that, they love to do that. So basically if you have a tiny crack in one, now you have to deal with both systems. Bet you didn't think about that when they made it. However, let's talk about the battery cooling system, because this is where things make or break this car as an electric car. First, when things are hot, battery is too hot, we need to cool it. We have two potential modes. The first one is very simple. You have a radiator, separate radiator for the battery cooling system, electric fan, electric water pump that circulates the coolant. Battery is too hot, we're going to route the coolant through another three-way valve. So now this is three-way valve number 2. We're going to send the coolant to the radiator, let it cool down. Fan is also there to assist. Then that colder coolant will go to the battery, cool it down, and then loop back. But if the heat is too much for this circuit to handle, there's actually a battery chiller. So what it'll do is it'll send the coolant, in addition to going to the radiator, it'll send it to this battery chiller that has AC refrigerant going to it to cool it down even further. I mean, AC refrigerant really works good for cooling. It is beyond me why they don't use that AC refrigerant just to go to the battery and cool it, but they must have a reason, and that's how they do it, because everybody actually does it that way. Nobody sends refrigerant directly to the battery like that, except very few. However, this is where things start to fall off when we talk about how do they heat the battery. See, batteries, they're very tricky. Lithium-ion batteries need to be at a very specific temperature to operate properly and at their optimum efficiency. If they're too hot, no good. Too cold, also not good. So when you start this car in 10-degree weather in Chicagoland in the middle of the winter, how is this going to do? Well, here's what's going to happen, and here's where things fell off. Normally, electric cars, this is where their thermal management system has to be on overdrive. It'll start taking every little bit of heat, utilizing the laws of thermodynamics, so every little bit of heat generated gets captured and used, first to warm up the battery, second to warm up the cabin. Genesis stopped right here, and I feel like they just went this shortcut route. They did not take it all the way. They could have, because the system actually have capacity to do that, but they went with the easy out. PTC heaters, electric heaters, to warm up the coolant, to warm up the cabin until things catch up, because it's only really the beginning. Once you start driving, normal friction will warm up the electric motors. Now you have more heat there. Then the inverters will warm up. You have more heat there, and we're good. It's just the beginning. Things will get really bad. If you drive the short distances, your range will be severely compromised because you have a giant behemoth of a PTC heater that is warming up the coolant. Folks, every time you have an electric car that heavily relies on PTC heaters for their coolant heating in the cold weather, that's a shortcut, an inefficient shortcut, because Tesla does not. And that is the statement here. That is how brilliant their system is. But back to the Genesis, they use PTC heaters, and that is a downside. That is not actually good. That's where their budget ran out, or they just said, let's just go the easy route. Doesn't matter. It does matter tremendously. And for those who are not familiar with what a PTC heater is, it's basically your household electric heater, little panel that heats up. That's what a PTC heater is. Now, you remember the last time you used that little personal heater, how much electricity it consumes? Exactly. I mean, we're trying to optimize the range here. This is a big, heavy car. Yes, we have a big battery, but every mile of range matters. That's the whole point. And then you have these two giant electricity consuming heaters that are killing your range just to warm up the battery, so it actually worked to give you better range. Do you see how this is counterproductive? And this is possibly the biggest downside of this system. Cold climate thermal management has a PTC heater, and it is not something there for a rainy day. No, that's the mode of operation. Not the best thing in the planet. Another very important system in electric cars is the HVAC system, because again, we need to cool the cabin, we need to heat the cabin. We don't have a heat generator like a gasoline cars, so this is the big thing. Now this is, I feel like, where they did very well. They have a pretty competent heat pump system. Interesting that they did one thing different than everybody else, which kind of goes into their PTC decision. Normally, car companies, when they do this system, a heat pump, they will not send refrigerant inside that is hot. They will have a separate cooling system that the hot refrigerant will warm up that coolant, and that warm coolant goes inside to warm up the cabin. That is more efficient because now you have warm coolant that, should there be a need, you can actually take some heat back from it. Here they don't do that. They actually have a separate condenser inside the car, which makes the HVAC system extremely complicated inside, unnecessarily, by the way. They send the refrigerant directly inside, and that's how you heat the cabin. For those who are not familiar, this is how a heat pump system works, or for that matter, the AC system works in 1 minute. Refrigerant, high pressure equals high temperature. Low pressure equals low temperature. So the AC system drops the pressure of the refrigerant, which equals low temperature of the refrigerant. Then a fan blows across the evaporator, which is a small radiator, takes some of the heat of the air, and now you have cold air blowing inside. But then when you add heat to this refrigerant, now you raise this pressure and now it's hot. How do you cool it? You send it around to the condenser, which is outside, a small radiator to get rid of the heat. Wait a second. What if we take this and flip it? That's basically what the heat pump system. So the cold side is outside, the hot side is inside. And that's your 1 minute explanation of possibly the most complicated system in the planet. If you are an HVAC expert, sorry that I skipped basically 99.9% of how the system works. But let's keep it simple here. Their heat pump system is good, except that part, which is a strange decision. And it has a lot to do with their PTC heater decision as well. Let's talk about some of the components and their location. And the first thing we're going to start with is why there is no frunk. And this is why. First, the electric motor sits in the front, a little bit down. Then the inverter is extremely large in size. I mean, if you look at an inverter from a Tesla, for example, it's tiny. We go back to the days where hybrids started. You look at the first generation Prius, Toyota Prius. Enormous inverter that did half the functions of the newer ones. And as we get newer and newer, these inverters get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they do more and more. That's the best part. This is a new electric car in its infancy. The inverter is, for lack of a better word, massive. There was no other way to put it. And then the thermal management system, it is rampant. Every single component is massive and huge. There is not really, because you have two separate cooling systems, and because you have all this integration between them, and because you don't really have a valve like Tesla, for example, the octo valve, that kind of combines all their operations into one compact unit, you have hoses and AC lines and electric power line everywhere. So they had to not make a frunk to fit all this stuff. All the thermal management system lives under the hood. Your battery chiller, your PTC heater for the coolant, your electric water pump, all the three-way valves, everything is scattered across. That's why you have everything here. But more importantly, if you look at the trunk of the electrified model, you'll see this giant hump. There's actually nothing behind that hump but sheet metal. But the reason that hump is there, because they had to make space to fit the rear inverter, again, which is a massive unit. Because the system has not been developed yet, or haven't matured yet, where they could start downsizing on these massive components. That's why you have the hump in the trunk, if you ever wondered. And lastly, on components, the 12-volt battery. It sits in the trunk. Interesting decision, because I feel like there is not really very well packaging here. I mean, you have cables everywhere, you have coolant hoses. They could have downsized and packaged it a little bit better, but they didn't, and that's okay. Having a battery in the trunk is not a big issue. But let's talk about how well the system actually functions, and this is really the most important thing. I think as an electric system, driving-wise, it is pretty good. Range is pretty good in mild to hotter temperature, but I think this system has severe compromises in colder climate because of the PTC heaters. And I think this is a new system in its infancy. Looking around, I feel like there was a lot of experimenting and a lot of kind of, we'll work on this on the next version, we'll do this better in the next version, let's just get this one out. That's how it feels looking around, because the routing of some of the stuff and the location of some important connectors are just sitting there ready to be filled up with water tells me they did not spend a lot of time actually optimizing the system to its full potential. So perhaps there will be a new version of this in the future, but this feels a little bit on the experimental side. Let's take a look underneath the G80 Electrified. And the first thing is, everything is covered up. It's a flat surface, and this is how all electric cars are, or the ones that are not should be. Let's take a look at the front suspension here and the brakes. So this is a typical rear-wheel drive car with the double wishbone setup. One control arm at the top, that is the double wishbone, and then two control arms here. There is something to be said here. And this is just a small mechanic's rant. They put this ball joint so close to the axle that removing it will either be a hassle, you have to remove the axle to remove this control arm. They could have flipped this perhaps to find a better way, but that's what they did. Everything here is aluminum except the outer tie rod and the strut mount right here, the lower mount. Interesting setup, and the sway bar is actually not plastic, it is steel, which is nice. So you have two ball joints right here, and then you have the ball joint up top. It's a single ball joint at the top. 4 piston calipers, actually a pretty massive caliper, because this is a retrofit. Remember, we actually do not need a brake caliper this big and this massive for an electric car, because you have regen braking. Interesting setup here. The steering is electric and the motor is outside here, which is something many manufacturers are doing these days. But everything else is aluminum. Upper control arm is aluminum, knuckle is aluminum, everything else. So 10, 15 years from now, when this wheel bearing goes out, which is a hub bearing unit, it will be basically welded to the aluminum knuckle. That is the downside of these. Otherwise, they're fine. As we walk our way back, and this is where the battery starts. There are a few observations about the battery. Now, having the battery this low in the body of the car, you have so much weight so low on the ground, it actually makes the car more stable, and that is kind of an added benefit to electric cars. But there are a few things here that are interesting. Everywhere you look in the suspension, it'll say Kia Hyundai. You'll see them stamped, except on the battery. The battery actually have the Genesis logo on it, which means this is an exclusive part to this, not shared with anything else. Pretty interesting thing. But then we look at a few things. First one is I'd like to draw your attention to is this area. So if you notice here, there is this aluminum piece that is capped. But then you look at this one is not capped, and then the top of the battery is actually open. So water and debris and all kinds of stuff you don't want getting around the battery will actually get here if they would have just extended this to cover, or better yet, put a cap here just like they did here. That would have been actually better. Same thing on the other side, but then we come to here, another area. This is wide open and there's nothing covering it up. It's very hard to see on camera, but this is wide open where water, debris, everything can actually, as you drive, gets channeled up and goes on top of the battery and makes the service of this battery, once it has to be removed or something, very, very difficult. You have all kinds of debris on top of it. That's okay. But then we look at the cover. This should be a structural cover, and it doesn't. Just shakes. Not the strongest cover in the world. Perhaps there is a cover behind it. I hope that is the case, but this doesn't feel very strong. Then we walk our way to the back. This is all covered up, and you notice the control arm has a cover, because when the car is down on the ground, this wheel will be pushed up. This will be a perfectly flat surface, and that's how electric cars get their perfect bottom where they don't have as much drag. But then we draw our attention to this massive behemoth that sits here. It's going to be a little bit difficult to show on camera, but this is why you have the hump in the rear trunk, which we're going to show you in a bit when we talk about the outside. Do you see this? This is the rear drive motor and the inverter on top of it. You see the hump starts right here, and there's these odd, I don't know if they are rivets or weird spot welds, but you could tell something is different here than the rest of the body. So this was a normal Genesis G80, and this is the part that got added for the electrified version. I think they could have done this a little better, but they didn't. You have all this space here. They could have cut on this storage space in the trunk that goes down and made the inverter sit back here, or I don't know, find a better place for it instead of cutting all the trunk space. But that's what they did. But let's look at the rear suspension, because there's something interesting about it. You notice the lower control arms are actually steel. They're not aluminum. This big one right here is aluminum. It's kind of an interesting shape. People assume it is this big. It is actually, all this is just plastic. The control arm is only this big. It's a very small control arm connecting to the rear knuckle. The rear knuckle is also aluminum with a steel wheel and hub and bearing, and the strut goes right here. And it is actually a strut. The spring is at the top. This particular one doesn't have air suspension. Pretty interesting setup here in the back. Also steel sway bar link, which is nice. Everything here feels retrofitted. I mean, you look at this subframe, which is, by the way, aluminum. If you look at it from this angle, it just looks odd. The shape of it, the design of it, and just the fitment of everything. You have all this open space, and then everything is so crammed up there. This could use more work, and this could be done a little better. Of course, being an electric car, we don't have exhaust or none of that, so this is all covered up. And by the way, you have all this wide open area. We could have put more stuff here to lower. That's just me thinking here, but they could have done this back better on the electrified version instead of cutting into your cargo space in the trunk. Let's take a look at the outside of the Genesis G80. And the first thing that have to be said about this one, I actually like how it looks. It is different. It's not just your standard car, luxury car of these days. It just has a distinct look to it. I really like their design language lately. And let's start with the very front. So because this is electric, we have the charge port. I love that they put the charge port right here where you have the G logo. You just push it and here comes the charge port. It does feel a little bit on the flimsy side when you push it, but overall it is pretty cool. It does have DC charging as well. It does have a little light here, kind of an indicator telling you where your charge generally is right now, so you wouldn't have to go inside the car to find out. I think that is pretty cool. Also here, right next to it, you notice there's a different appearance to this. This is actually a radar sensor. I like how they integrated the grille, and the grille is closed. That's how electric cars are, but it doesn't look like a strange electric car look where there's nothing in the front. It still looks like a grille. It's just closed off when you look at it closely. Now, they have the Genesis logo right here. Actually, I like their logo. It's not, you know, a standard round logo. It looks pretty cool, I think. The headlights are pretty interesting. They're this big bars, two slashes, if you would. I think they look pretty good. They work pretty good. And it just gives this, you cannot mistake this look. You cannot mistake this for anything but a Genesis. I like that they're going after that. They want to establish their brand image, and all their cars will have this similar design language, and that is pretty cool. Then we look at the hood, which has some interesting things. Most car manufacturers these days, they're going after this swoopy look. There's actually just have two lines in the middle, little indentation in, and then this raised edge right here. You notice there's a raise right here. Kind of gives it a unique character, and the flat fender right here, that is pretty cool. The side, you have that kind of similar design language with the turn signals. Actually, these turn signals are so bright. When you look at them at night, they literally light the entire road. The wheels are probably my least favorite thing. I feel like they don't match the character of this car, but that's what they went with. Unfortunately, they decided to go with staggered tires. This one is a 245, rear one is a 275. So no tire rotations, and premature wear is in the kind of the future of this car. As we walk around, there's actually not a lot going on in the side. They do have this one crease that goes all the way to the end. And this shape right here, they kind of went with the swooped back, gives it somewhat of a coupe look. It does have a pretty interesting profile on the side. I actually like it. Looks pretty cool, and kind of the trunk lid comes down as well, and then it comes back up almost like an integrated lip spoiler. Looks pretty cool. Then as we wrap our way to the back, I love this almost 90-degree turn. Gives it character. And then we have similar design language of the two slashes. I like what they're doing lately with their designs. I think they distinguish themselves. You cannot mistake this for anything but a Genesis, which they do have written out right here. Interesting thing about the trunk is the button is like right here, a place that you initially might not notice. Once you get used to it, just a button, you press it, and the trunk opens. Speaking of the trunk, in the electrified version, the trunk has gone on a diet, for lack of a better word. Basically, you have this giant hump, which many people have wondered why it is. Some people have said the battery is not here. As we looked at, it is underneath the car. What this hump is, basically the sheet metal behind it. And as we talked about when we looked underneath it, the inverter is right here. That's why they needed the space underneath the car, so they made the hump. It's still a decent sized trunk, but without the hump, obviously it would have been very nice. Something interesting here, and this is of course a luxury car, everything is covered up, the hinges are covered. This is pretty cool. It is an electric trunk. You do have two buttons here, one closes it and one locks the doors and closes it, which is nice. These are the little stuff that make luxury cars today make sense, because normal cars have gotten so good that they have to make specific features in luxury cars to make them make sense for their price. Let's talk about the interior of the G80 Electrified. And this interior overall is nice. It's a luxury car, of course, you know, they gotta make it nice. But there are a few things that are interesting. So the materials here are not top notch. The leather is okay, the wood is nice, but they're not over the top. Let's put it this way. But the fit and finish is pretty cool, and I like how they laid everything out. But the most important thing is, this doesn't feel like some strange electric car where everything is upside down. This feels like a normal car. Shifter, gauge, everything is normal. Key, start button, everything else, because this was, after all, not really intended to be an electric car. It was kind of retrofitted. But let's talk about some of the highlights of the interior. First thing is, the HVAC system has a mode where if you have heavy use and you shut it off, it'll actually display a message and tell you automatic drying will start in X amount of time. What that mode is, it'll run the blower motor behind the scenes to dry the evaporator, so you would not have a bad odor. That is actually a pretty cool feature, a feature that I wish every car manufacturer would have. And then another thing that is not very good is this $80,000 very nice electric car does not have a sunroof, for reasons beyond me. Why would luxury cars not have a sunroof, let alone a panoramic sunroof? Well, this one doesn't have any of that. Let's talk about the layout of things, starting with the gauges. So the gauge is this very big screen, which is fine in an electric car, but it has one thing very interesting. It has a 3D gauge option. Call me old, but it does make me dizzy, and it doesn't work very well. I mean, you really have to focus really hard to see it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, and now it makes you dizzy. A little bit gimmicky. The infotainment system is pretty large, pretty far away. It does have a rotary dial to control it. It is touchscreen, but it does feel like a kind of a spruced up Hyundai system. Still laggy when it starts. It is featureful, does have a few interesting features, but overall it works. But it's a little bit laggy, especially when you start it up. Then there is something in the center console. I usually don't like all the climate controls in the screen, where it really makes it a hassle more than it is. I just want to change the temperature or direction. Here they went kind of a both worlds in between. You do have everything dedicated button, but it's actually a touch screen. And right in the middle, temperature dials and some physical buttons for the important stuff. But all the other controls are in this dedicated screen, which I guess does work. At least it's not a separate menu altogether. The shifter is a rotary dial, but it's not my least favorite rotary dial because it has one thing that is interesting. It's not a free-floating rotary dial like some models. This actually, you push it to the left, it goes into reverse, you push it a little bit, it goes into neutral, you push it all the way to the right, it goes into drive, and park is a physical button in the middle. That is the better form of a rotary dial. Normal shifter would have been fine too, but I understand it's an electric car. There's not really anything to shift. You're just telling the system, let's go forward or let's go back. But then this area, this aluminum right here, actually looks very nice, and kind of the cockpit thing going on here. What I like about it the most is I actually like this rotary dial, because sometimes you want to reach the screen, it's a little bit far, and having this and the touch screen together makes it work better. But my favorite thing is the volume rotary dial and the tune next to it. That is something I wish every car would have. It makes life much easier, but equally, you have the same one on the steering wheel. Makes changing the volume super simple. That's how every car, not pushing up and down and a plus and minus, you just have a rotary dial. Pretty cool, pretty interesting, and I like it. Then there are a few interesting things here. The wireless charger is all the way here, which I wish they would have found a better place for. It's kind of far and hidden. That's just my opinion. And then the center console, it's dual opening where you can have one open, but usually this style will have some kind of button here or on the side. This one is here, so you press it expecting this whole thing to open. Then you lift your arm and one of them opens, or both. Wish they would have done this a little bit differently. That's okay. Not the end of the world. Something else about the interior, which is very, very curious. The passenger seat has controls here, which you'll find how offending those are when we talk about the back seat. That's okay. The seats are nice. They have this diamond stitching on them. They look pretty nice, pretty standard for a luxury car of this segment, but they are very hard. Just when you sit on them, you feel them. They're very hard, and overall they're okay. They're not heavily bolstered where they dig in, but they are hard. And this car, normally in the non-electric version, it does have paddle shifters, but you notice this is electric and it also has paddle shifters. I like how they utilize the paddle shifters in a way that actually works pretty well. So this is your regenerative braking control. So you want more regenerative braking, you can increase it with that or lower it. Or they also have iPedal, which is basically one pedal driving. Does work pretty good. Hyundai, we tested the Ioniq 5. That works really good. And in this one, it works pretty similar. It is actually, you can drive this one pedal driving. Some manufacturers have it, but it just doesn't work as well. This one works really good. Let's talk about how this car is to drive, kind of the behavior of this car. The first thing is sound insulation is pretty good, but what really helps it be pretty good, they have an active noise cancellation. So basically any vibration or noise that occurs as you drive, there is a microphone that picks it up, and then the speakers will create an opposite wave which cancels that sound. It doesn't do magic or wonders, but it does make things nice in here, and sounds are very well muffled. But the driving experience and how it is over bumps and everything as a luxury car is pretty interesting. Listen to this description. Initially, it won't make sense. It is smooth, but harsh. These are two contradicting things. When you're driving on a nice road, it is smooth. You don't feel any of the flutter or vibration that typically with harsher cars you feel them. But then when you hit bumps, it is jarring and hard. Rarely will you see that in cars. You'll either have very smooth, floaty ride where you feel nothing, or you'll have harsh cars that vibrate on even smooth surfaces. This one kind of does half and half. Very interesting. Not a lot of cars actually feel like this. And then there is the back seat, is where things start to significantly fall apart. First thing is, this is my seating position in the passenger seat. I'm 5'7". I'm not tall. I don't have a lot of space here. But the worst thing is, I am sitting down. Look at this giant space for my knee, underneath my knees. This seat is so low that you basically have to sit down in a weird position. It is super uncomfortable. And for a luxury car that has seat controls on the side, so this tells me somebody at Genesis was thinking maybe this will be chauffeur driven. This is a horrible place to be for any kind of adult. And what caused this, I think, they have to raise the floor to put the battery underneath it. As we saw when we looked at the battery, it's underneath the car. This is not good. And the best thing is you have your HVAC controls here, you have this big console which you can open and close your rear shade, and you have these touch lights that are really cool, but the seat is not comfortable. So where are we going with this? That's the one thing about the back seat. It is not good. There is no other way to put it. You have a manual shade, which is a little bit not okay, because this is $80,000 here. We would have wished if this was electric, but it is not. Otherwise, I suppose if they fix the seat, this would be a nicer place to be, but we really had to compare it to other cars to understand why is the seat not comfortable? And that's what it was. It's too low. There's not enough real estate from the floor to the seat to make it a comfortable place to be. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the G80 Electrified, starting with the design of the electric system. The minute electric car designers go to PTC heaters to remedy the lack of heat, and they really did not push the envelope, that's really a failure in my book, because you severely compromise the whole point of the electric car. The minute those PTC heaters come on, your battery range will be severely affected, and there's no way around it. PTC heaters consume a lot of electricity, and that's basically taking a shortcut. If you look at the likes of Tesla, I mean, they have an 8-way valve. They really went over and above to get every last bit of heat. They pushed the thermodynamic laws to the limit to make their car run without PTC heaters. Here, I feel like we started that, then we backed out, and we just went the easy route that is inefficient. That's the first problem from the mechanical side. The second problem is, it feels experimental. It feels every bit of a retrofit. And that's exactly what it is. This was not built from the ground up as an electric car, and you see it. Looking around, there are some things that are questionable, the way things are routed, and then long-term reliability remains a question mark, and a big one, because some of the components feel a little on the cheaper side. Going back to the car itself, the rear seat is probably the biggest offense here. I mean, you could have really done better in the back seat. The angle of entrance into the back seat, if you're a little bit taller, you will hit your head, and it's super uncomfortable. The back seat is tiny, and they really could have done a lot of work. And on top of that, what is most offensive about the back seat is the fact that you can move the passenger seat from buttons on the side that's usually reserved for chauffeur-driven cars. I'm sorry, if you're chauffeur-driven in this is not a good experience. The back seat really could use work. But then the front seat, the seats are extremely hard. Some people will like that, but most won't, because that makes it uncomfortable on long trips. And worse than that is, the ride is crashy. It is smooth, but crashy. And I hope that is making sense here. You go over bumps, it is extremely jarring. And the combination of the jarring ride with the hard seats make it a little bit uncomfortable. And that is kind of the opposite of point of a luxury car. So should you buy a 2023 Genesis G80 Electrified? Folks, as an electric car, range-wise, this system manages the battery well. The range is decent, it holds up, it has good regeneration, which is good. However, where it kind of has a disadvantage is in cold climate. PTC heaters, let's reiterate that one more time, is when designers or engineers basically gave up and went the easy, inefficient route, and this is what this has. This feels like it could use more work. If they really improve their cold climate or get rid of those PTC heaters, find a better way. We only have a 3-way valve here. There's 2 of them, but the problems with this car begin when you really start looking under the microscope. First thing is, this is not a $50,000 car. This is not a $60,000 car. This is an $80,000 car with tiny back seats, and it feels like a retrofit. It feels like an incomplete project. And at that price point, it puts you deep into the territory of the elites in electric cars, namely Tesla. Yes, their build quality is a question mark. Yes, their interiors are basically no interior, it's just a giant screen, while this feels like just a normal car that is electric, which is nice to some folks. But honestly, the technology, that stuff that matters, the thermal management system, the way the range is and everything else in Teslas is leaps and bounds ahead of this on every level. The truth have to be said, and they basically cost the same. This car, however, does have some advantages, and the biggest one of those is it is a normal car. You don't need a master's degree to operate one. Anybody who is not into cars, average Joe, can open the door, get in, started, drive it, not really have a learning curve, because it is, after all, a normal car. This was not built from the ground up to be an electric car, and you feel that in a good way when you use it, in a bad way because of the compromises. Biggest compromise being, this is a big sedan. It is a luxury sedan. That back seat could really use improvement. That's probably the biggest thing. Long-term reliability is a question mark. There are some cheaper feeling stuff when you look around. However, that is yet to be seen because this is one of a kind, and electric cars altogether have not really been around for long, so time will tell, I suppose. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.